And joining me now from the New York Times is German Lopez. When I booked him, he was a reporter on the reporter side, and now he has joined the opinion section, and we'll get to that in a minute. But he was the author of an article about a month ago on some new data that was released about how nearly half of all murders in America go unsolved. The point is that essentially, if you murder someone in America, you got a 50-50 chance of getting away with it. And the data's not quite 50-50, but we're gonna get into the reasons for this. But I can't think of a more timely conversation, given suddenly the president is currently interested in crime that in the visuals that he can see. When if this were the focus, that the real issue of criminal justice, of the issue of crime in America, arguably might be this. This is a nationwide problem that isn't something that can be solved one jurisdiction at a time. And yet it's something, I thought this was one of those headlines that, boy, this should get people's attention. And it seemed to land with crickets. So what happens when that happens? You do your best to try to surface it. So I've invited German onto the podcast because I really want to explore this issue more. And because if we really want to feel safe in America, perhaps, we might want to start with solving the most egregious crimes that take place against humanity, like murder. German, welcome to the Toddcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start with the piece. You've been covering criminal justice issues for over a decade. So this is obviously on your beat. I just found this framing to be really clarifying. And here's this one story that once you start to peel the onion, you realize, oh, we don't have enough cops. Oh, we don't have enough of these resources. Oh, we don't have enough of these resources. And so when you think about people's complaints about law and order in general, that if you actually began with this focus, perhaps everything else sort of falls into place if you can crack this part of the code. But but you're the expert. This is your beat. So tell me how you went about this and what why you framed it the way you decided to frame it.
Yeah, so I've been fascinated by clearance rates. That's what this statistic is called. Essentially, how many murders are cleared means how many result in an arrest. I've been fascinated by this for years because the U.S. has historically been very behind rich countries. Like when we're talking about like Japan or Germany or Australia, those kinds of examples, like they have clearance rates in the 90s, like 90+%. Japan famously solves almost all of its murders. They have fewer of them, so it's easier for them to do that, but they have fewer of them. So the US historically is usually around 50 to 60%, especially after COVID. The most recent data suggests it's bumped up a little to around 60%. But I should say that even that's a little misleading because that includes murders that happened in previous years that were solved in the year where the data was reported. So if you actually subtract those previous year murders, the clearance rate is more around 40%, depending on the city, which is obviously even more than half of people who kill someone in that year will get away with it at least for that year. And for me, this is just alarming. That there's a thing in criminal justice system where there are three ways to deter someone. One is the severity of the punishment. So, if somebody thinks they're going to face a long prison punishment, they might decide, I'm not going to do that crime. If they think they're going to get away with it, then that's the other thing, is the certainty of punishment is important. So if somebody thinks they're going to get away with it, then, they might think, I'm going to do this crime anyway. I mean, a long prison punishment penalty isn't going to matter if you think you can get away with the crime. And the third thing is the speed of punishment, because people not only have to be certain, but it has to come fast. Like, I murdered someone and a few days later I was arrested. That sends a signal to the rest of the community that, like, look, the police are taking this very seriously.
And you're going to get caught.
Exactly. And yeah.
How does this compare to 30 years ago? Has this always been the case? Is this historically a consistent pattern here of essentially unresolved murder cases?
No, it's clearance rates in general have gone down over the past few decades. I should say that there's some discussion among criminal justice experts about how much of this was like, police were just locking up anyone they could pick up. Like you think about the level of evidence that they gather now, DNA evidence, the forensic
Mhm.
stuff. Like and also generally they had to clear a higher bar because like
Mhm.
courts no longer accept just police picking up anyone off the street and claiming that they're a murderer. And so prosecutors will send back those cases, and police know that, so they'll be more careful with their arrests.
Mhm.
So in general, we've seen a decline in clearance rates, but it's not clear how much of that is that like, you know, to some degree, it might be that police have gotten better at their jobs because they're not
Mhm.
being as abusive with criminal suspects. But to some degree, it probably is that police just aren't taking this as seriously as they once used to. It used to be a big part of policing in the U.S. that they focused on clearance rates, and over time, we've transitioned to this model of more proactive policing. So we try to stop crime before it happens.
Right.
And as we've done that, we've put less emphasis on actually solving crimes once they do happen.
And yet we have more data than ever, right? DNA, between I look at two things, you know, let me frame it another way. The perception of safety in America, I think, has gotten better in my lifetime, not worse. And I think the number one reason is this: surveillance, meaning the likelihood that you're going to be on camera doing the crime, whether it's violent crime or petty crime. But the idea that the likelihood there'll be evidence that you did it is never been higher. The ability to use DNA evidence to find a particle that will connect a suspect to the crime and make it possible to get a conviction. We've never had more tools at our disposal. And yet the counterpoint is here we have all of these extra tools that the police didn't have. So obviously it does mean, oh my God, how many people got convicted for crimes that they probably didn't commit. So that's one thing you worry about when you look at the 20th century versus the 21st. But why is it that these new tools haven't been able to actually increase the likelihood that police can solve these crimes?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. In some cases, police just haven't really, caught up with the modern era and are not using cameras as much as they could be. There's also like civil libertarians really take issue with the idea of surveillance, and they have tried to legally restrain police. And like, look, they have some legitimate complaints. I'm not saying that like the police
Mm-hmm.
should have access to like every new technology and abuse it accordingly, but like there is some pushback there, and police have to deal with that. They ultimately answer to, city
Mm-hmm.
councils and mayors and governors and all of that. But another issue is frankly just funding. Police, that there are actually, if you walk around a modern city, I live in Cincinnati, so
Mm-hmm.
when I walk around, there are these like poles of that hold cameras and actually audio devices at the top, and they can hear gunshots. They
Mm-hmm.
record people on the street. People can actually see these probably never in a modern city, and they become more popular recently. But police haven't adopted them as widely
Hmm.
as you would think. So, when you think about like how people are getting away with murder in this modern surveillance state, that's part of it, is that they can't necessarily access all the cameras, and they really might not have cameras around to begin with, depending
Mm-hmm.
on where you're talking about.
All right, but what about on the DNA side of things, right? In some ways, there's never been more ways to find evidence that, frankly, it was evidence that existed before, but we didn't have the technology to identify it. Right now, we have the technology to identify DNA evidence. Um, is this another case of lack of adoption, or is this it's just not as easy as TV makes it look?
I would say that it's not as easy as TV makes it look, and the biggest thing you have to consider is the proliferation of guns in the U.S. You
Mm-hmm.
are just much less likely to leave behind DNA evidence if you're shooting someone than if you're stabbing them. So you
Mm-hmm.
think about, if you think about like a CSI episode, it's
Right.
often like a husband killing his wife or something along those lines, like people who intimately know each other. And the episodes about uncovering that, those are usually crimes where, they're up close. There's
Mm-hmm.
physical evidence
Right.
everywhere. In a lot of these shootings, I mean, people are just driving by a house and gunning people down, and nobody even sees the face of the shooter.
Mhm.
They might still know who the shooter was or have their
Yeah.
suspicions, but they might not have actually seen them. So if you think about it in that situation, that makes it much harder to solve these crimes.
Is it easy to classify the unsolved cases? Is there a pattern here? It's more of it's the murders that are harder to are murders that take place where it is a gunman and where the gunman is 10 feet away or more. Like, is it that?
Yes.
Can you divvy it up that concrete?
Yeah, so there are like I would say there are layers. One, if it's a shooter,
Hmm.
then distance obviously matters as well, and
Hmm.
then gang related,
Hmm.
because if the gang related crimes are more likely to be not necessarily anonymous, but the victim and shooter might not know each other, or at least the victim's family might not know the shooter.
Hmm.
That's more likely to happen. Also, gangs are just better at covering up crimes since they have more experience with it, so they
Right.
might know how to avoid getting caught to begin with. And so I think those three factors really play a big role. And the US does generally have more shootings and more gang crime than other countries. So that would explain some of the discrepancy when you look at Japan, which has very few guns,
Hmm.
very little gang activity that results in murder. Um, so that I think that's one of the biggest things driving it is just, the US has a lot of guns and gangs are using them.
So, okay, that's another part of this. If How many of these unsolved murders are likely gang related?
It's hard to say because it depends on city by city, and the statistics, frankly, aren't that great. But
Mm,
in some cities, it's the vast majority of shootings are gang related.
right.
Well, maybe not some cities, but at least in some neighborhoods, the vast majority of shootings, I should say, are gang related. So when you're looking at that level of things, there can be like you know, your entire community might be riddled by crime that's unsolved. I mean, that's another thing that's striking, I should say, about these clearance rate statistics is like, we're talking about national statistics, right?
Right.
But when you start looking at the city and neighborhood level, there are
Yeah.
some places where clearance rates can drop to like single digits, like 9% and lower,
Right.
because there's so few attention going to the issue.
Well, it's that, or is there fear? Like eyewitnesses don't want to cooperate. There's that
Oh,
aspect as well.
that's absolutely part of it. I
Yeah.
mean, it's also just a vicious cycle, right? If you know
Yeah.
that people are getting away with murder, you are less likely to testify as a witness because you have no confidence that the police can actually protect you if you come forward, speak up, testify in
Mm,
court, right? Like the, the criminal justice system fundamentally relies on our belief that it is protecting us, our trust.
yeah.
And if you don't have that, then it starts fraying. And I think that's what we see when we look at these clearance rate numbers, especially in minority and poor neighborhoods. They have lots of reasons, not just the
Yeah.
low clearance rates, to not trust police, and that leads to all sorts of problems in solving murders.
I grew up in Miami in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And in the 80s, we were the murder capital of the world. And I will tell you, I never felt unsafe, right? Because there was a belief. And I think over time we learned this is that 90% of these murders were both the victim and the shooter. It was all part of the same world, right? It felt like as if, yes, this was happening in Miami, but this was disputes between cartels. These days, the difference between a gang and a cartel is just the name, right?
Right.
Arguably, it's the same thing. And, and there was this feeling that, well, if you're not involved in nefarious activities, you're going to be safe. Is that still the case? Is that how you would tell people that, because, because I felt that way when I was here in DC too, is that I lived in DC when it was the murder capital of the world in the early 90s. And yet I
This
never
seems to
felt
follow you
unsafe.
around, Chuck. What's
Right. I
going
know.
on?
Right. Well, I remember my grandfather's wife, when I decided to go to school in DC, this is in 1989. She goes like, it's so unsafe there. And I went, Ella, we live in Miami. Like we just like they made an entire television. There's a huge television show called Miami Vice that is, and yet I said, do you feel unsafe? And it was sort of like having this conversation. And that's this sort of, and how concentrated, I guess it goes back to, it's always felt as if these things are concentrated in these communities. Is that still the case?
Yes, that is definitely the case. Crime is just super concentrated in general. I mean, Some cities had programs where they literally focus on like just dozens or even hundreds of people within the city and demonstrably brought crime down. This
Right.
is there's a famous example in Boston called the Boston Miracle, where they famously focus on just like these slivers of offenders, like people they knew were doing
Hmm.
certain crimes, and crime just plummeted by 50% through in the city throughout the course of this program. And it's that can hide it from other people. But I think the
Hmm.
reverse of that is in those communities where there are all these people committing crimes, it feels much, much worse than
Right.
even the crime statistics might suggest.
So why, I mean, this seems like the obvious thing, which is you surge law enforcement resources to your most, vulnerable neighborhoods. Why, if it worked in Boston, why isn't this replicated around the country?
There's a lot of, political interests that go into policing, I would say.
Hmm.
So, one thing is actually solving crimes or deterring crimes, right? Like we have good evidence that if police are just in a block, people are less likely to commit crime. Who's going to be stupid enough to shoot someone else in front of a
Right.
police officer,
Right.
right? It's called a scarecrow effect in
Hmm.
criminology. And so yes, you can surge resources there. But the other thing is a perception of crime. And I think this is just as important.
Hmm.
There are plenty of neighborhoods. I see this in Cincinnati where there are like police patrolling all these nice businesses because the business owners in the area want to feel safe. And of course, they're entitled to feel safe. But the
Of course.
reality is crime is probably not happening in those places where there are lots of wealthier businesses, right? Like
Hmm.
just in nature, that's not how crime works. So I think police have to deal with that conflict and that limits their resources.
Hmm.
And you often see this with like surges of police in cities where they just start targeting what are frankly the wrong neighborhoods. They're like the idea of surging police officers in a block or neighborhood or whatever, that does have strong empirical evidence, and it does have some effect no matter where you are, but it could
Hmm.
have a bigger impact in the neighborhoods that frankly just have less political capital, so they can't really ask for police help as easily as wealthier businesses could.
Um, so are we in a situation where we know what would work? We just don't we don't have the political will, or we're still trying to figure out best practices?
I mean, I would say it's a little bit of both in the end, but I would mostly lean on the first thing, which is we know what to do, and we just have not really like used the resources for it. You see this kind of thing all the time in politics. So, in his first term, for example, President Trump actually his budgets repeatedly suggested cutting police funding, and uh, I think one thing that's interesting about that is not necessarily that it led to police cuts because Congress by and far did, by for the most part, did not pass those budgets.
Right.
But there was no conversation about whether they should increase funding in certain neighborhoods, right? Like the conversation was like, should we do Trump's budget or not? And the answer was
Mm-hmm.
not. Okay, so like, should we? There was never really a conversation about this. And obviously, you had the defund the police movement, which had a big effect as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in the end, the conversation has been really focused on like, how limited can we keep police resources? Like, what's the least we can spend on this? But I think that runs into a bunch of problems. Number one, you can't solve crime as easily. Detectives, you want
Mm-hmm.
smart people on those jobs, and smart people are going to demand higher salaries.
Right.
And two, like even if you're just worried about the police accountability issue that we've heard so much of with Black Lives Matter and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
like one way that you make sure police officers are better is by making sure that that they have higher education or
Right.
go through certain training or are just smarter, better people. And like smarter, better people are generally going to be able to get jobs elsewhere with more competitive pay. So why would they go
Mm-hmm.
to a police department? And like I think in this way you can really think about like, there's a dearth of resources going to these departments. A lot of them have dealt with shortfalls in recent
Mm-hmm.
years, like staffing shortages, where they cannot hire nearly as many cops as they want to hire. Here in Cincinnati, uh, the police department is supposed to be staffed at around 1,100 cops. It's
Mm-hmm.
missing 100 to 200 people
Isn't that the
in the
story
past
in
few
every
years.
major metro
And yes,
area?
yes,
Yeah.
I was about to say that's the story in every major metro
Yeah.
area. And some of that is, you know, it's social. Like like liberals do not want to become cops anymore because they do not see it as a good profession, right? And some of it is political is
Right.
political in that sense, and then some of it is just financial. They literally can't
Right.
entice enough cops to come in with proper pay.
Well, you hear this, some police officers feel like they're not respected anymore, so why bother? Right.
Right.
You hear that conversation. And right, you just talked about the divide. I mean, I think about Joe Biden and Bill Clinton in the mid '90s and 100,000 cops on the street and the surge of that and how that was universally popular. And of course, then it became a divisive issue inside the Democratic Party a generation later, right?
Right.
And because incarceration rates seem to be rise among more vulnerable groups that where it looks like a lot of profiling was taking place. So, um, I guess that this is the problem. If you could take politics out of this issue and just made it hey, do you want to solve this problem? And here are best practices to do it. These are the funding levels we need. This is the training levels we should have. And these are the metrics police departments have to meet. And if you don't meet it, you lose certain funding. I mean, it seems like this isn't, like most things in our political sphere of debate. The solution isn't that there's 17 solutions sitting on a shelf. You just got to decide which one is politically viable in the moment.
Right. And, you know, I think one of the things that makes this tricky is that the concerns and criticisms are legitimate to some degree, right?
Like, of
A lot
course.
of bad cops get away with things that they should not be getting away with. And so it's understandable that people feel the way they do. I mean, we've all seen the police shooting videos of the last few years. They're horrendous. And like
And I'm
I
sorry, if you're an African American male in this country, you do have a lot. I understand why you have some
oh,
distrust of the cops because you feel singled
absolutely.
out. You feel profiled.
Well, not only do you feel profiled, but you feel like they're not protecting you because of the
Right.
clearance rate stuff we're talking about, right? I mean, I think
Are a
it's how
majority, I was just going to say, do we know, is a majority of unsolved murders people of color?
I'm not sure if it's a majority necessarily, probably depends on the year, but the
Hmm.
clearance rates for uh, black victims, like murders where there are black
Hmm.
victims, are much worse. So in general, we do know that's the case. And like I think it's useful for people to just put themselves in the shoes of someone living in that environment where, you know, police harass them for petty nonsense that doesn't really do much for anyone's public safety. There are murders all the time and shootings all the time. They literally hear gunshots when they're
Hmm.
just going to bed. And
By the way, if there were
then,
gunshots in my community, there'd be outrage and there'd be all sorts of politicians surging around. And you sit there and you're like, if it happens in the south part of the county, everybody just says, oh, yeah, it's just another night where I heard gunshots.
right, exactly. And then
Yeah.
on top of that, you know, whoever did the shooting is probably going to get away with it. Like, I mean, just imagine living in that environment. What's that tell you? You
Yeah.
think there's no one who can protect me here. I can't trust the police. It's understandable to have that sentiment.
Hmm.
And I think that the fact that those criticisms, those complaints are valid just makes it
Hmm.
much harder to, you know, as a politician, argue that we should be spending more on police.
You grounded your story in Louisville, not too far from Cincinnati, and in some ways they're very. You could, I guess, there's probably some similarities between the two cities. Louisville has been a little bit more in the news for its actions of its police
Yes.
department, and they've had some federal oversight in what they've done and haven't done, et cetera. Breonna Taylor, obviously, the incident, the murder of Breonna Taylor being sort of a touchstone there. So unpack Louisville's police department. It was sort of the example you led with. What would it take to make that a better police department?
I mean, I think the first thing, and they would tell you this because I asked them a lot of questions, and this is the one that they emphasize is they just need to have full staffing. They are. The last time I looked at the numbers, they were like severely understaffed, like by the hundreds of police officers. Like it's a big city, so you know that number might sound big, but that's how many police officers they need to hire. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is they really do need to rebuild trust with the community trust that they've lost. I mean,
Mhm.
they have lost it for very understandable reasons. Like the community is upset for very legitimate grounds, and now they need to work to show the community that they're protecting them. that makes it difficult to actually get to the job of solving murders, right? Like if the community doesn't trust you, solving murders requires witnesses. So they need those people. And the third thing that I heard from a lot of experts is just, look, they should increase the use of modern technology. We talked about cameras, like that's a big thing. And they've said that they've started to do some of that. They told me as much. But at the end of the day, there are still a lot of places where there are blind spots. There are still a lot of shootings where they will tell you they have no physical evidence or surveillance footage or whatever. So that to me suggests they could be doing more along those grounds. Even if it's not like, how many people want a camera installed in the middle of their street? But
Mhm.
like you could try to work with the community. People have cameras all over their houses nowadays,
Right.
right? So like you could try to work with the community to like actually know that those things are there, that you can access them and so forth. So those are three big steps, but I think it would make a tremendous difference. I will say though that the hiring part of this is probably the most difficult, just because, you know, they simply cannot find enough officers, and especially enough officers from Louisville in a community that does not trust them.
Right. I mean, the biggest is, you want your police force to look like the community you're policing.
Right.
And that seems to be a challenge for many of these forces.
Right. I think, in other countries they've done like reconciliation commissions, things like
Mm.
that. When the government messes up and they
Mhm.
want to rebuild trust and all that, and they basically come forward, admit their mistakes. They do
Mhm.
these long reports, and I'm not sure how much that stuff helps, but I doubt it can hurt. Like
Mhm.
at this point, many police departments have seriously lost the trust of their communities, and they need to show that they care. I hear the officers too all the time who are very upset that like, they feel underappreciated because many
Mhm.
of them are doing a good job and still
Right.
they're being lumped in with all these other criticisms.
Welcome to every industry, right? Like, welcome
Yes,
to the world
no,
of journalism, right? You're like, yes, they're bad actors, but like they're in the minority, I swear, right? I
right.
mean, we talk about this in so many walks of life, and that the 5% of bad apples end up defining 90% of the actors, and that doesn't help anybody.
Right. But I think frankly, like if you're an officer, I mean, you should know you're publicly accountable. Like that's just how things work, right? This is a job serving the public, and sometimes you're going to hear things that you don't like. And like it's just somehow police departments have to figure out how to build that resilience. And I think sometimes the messaging back and forth, I will say like from critics and from their
Mhm.
supporters just does not help. It seems to escalate the conflict
Yeah.
rather than toning it down.
Well,
And
because
look,
the
I'm
politicians are weaponizing it. They're
right,
exploiting.
of
They're
course.
exploiting the anger among cops. We see politicians do that. People don't care about cops. Thin blue line, right? Back to the blue, and we don't. And then you see it with those who feel as if the cops have been abusive and all of that. So this is I feel like the politicians have made the conversation between the actual policing community and the communities themselves harder to have, um, because of the political, I don't know if we call them overtones or undertones in this case, but
Right, I think that's the exact right framing though, because it is basically if you talk to like actual people on the ground, they have much more, I would say, moderate views, but the conversation is dominated by extremists. I think a classic example of this is
Mhm.
if in around 2020, when it was the height of defund the police,
Right.
um, if you went into like community meetings with police officers, very often what you would see, it was white progressives saying defund the police, and then it was black moms saying, no, 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 I want
I
more
want cops on my
cops.
street. Yeah, I just
Right.
want
I
honest
want my
cops.
son to be protected.
Yeah.
Please get these drug dealers out, etc. And like, I think to me that's really because those are the stories I heard. I mean, I talked to a bunch of family members of victims, and they were all black because they are the disproportionate victims of these murders. And all of them said the same thing. Like, look, I know that cops do a lot of wrong things, but ultimately I want them to have my back when something this bad happens to me, when I lose a family member and so
Mhm.
forth. And I think, I mean, we see this with all sorts of political issues, right? That the extremists kind of
Mhm.
take over the
Right.
conversation. But I just don't think that is not really representative of the everyday American. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Um, let's talk about the puzzle solvers themselves, meaning the actual homicide detectives. I would think that to recruit in that is actually it. Is that also difficult, that specific part of the law enforcement community, or is that actually seen as sort of a more prestigious gig in the world of policing?
I mean, it's certainly seen as more prestigious, but I guess it depends on some cops. Some cops really revel in the idea of like being a patrol officer and
Mhm.
stay their beat and their neighborhood and all that. But I think generally police departments do treat it as like a higher prestigious, more position. But the thing is, it requires a lot of work, right? Like you might be called at odd hours because a murder just happened, and as we know, murders are much, or any crime is much easier to solve if you're on the scene fast.
Right.
So that's one thing. It requires a lot of training and intellectual work that you might not do in day-to-day policing. And it just and then on top, so once you start stacking those requirements, I come back to the issue of pay, right? Like somebody who is really well equipped to be a detective, they might also choose to do other investigative work. They could work
Right.
for a think tank. They could be a journalist. They could do
Yeah.
all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And those jobs generally pay higher than a police detective might make, especially when we're talking about, smaller towns and so forth.
I'm, I mean, is it as simple as police department? If you hit a certain funding level, you get bonus money. Is that an incentive that's worth pursuing, or would that be the equivalent of putting bounties out there that might actually backfire, right? Where there's an incentive to just close the case
I,
and
I
find,
guess,
yeah,
yeah, I guess that would worry. The thing that would worry me about something like that is like, it would basically help the winners. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
if you're already hitting a 70% clearance rate, let's say, do
Right,
you really need the more funding than somebody who's struggling at 40%? Like
right.
that would be my concern with it. But I mean, in general, I'm not totally sure how to do it, but I think we need to figure out a way to funnel resources into places that are solving or struggling the most with solving murders and dealing with more murders.
Is the FBI at all? I mean, look, I don't want to get into the current leadership of the FBI because I really fear what we've done, and politicizing the leadership of the FBI is a very dangerous course. But let's let's pretend we live in this neutral world right now, and the FBI is sort of the FBI you and I have been used to dealing with, which is functionally has tried to be apolitical, right? Up until this most recent set of leaders, this most current leadership. Um, are they too, I get the sense that in some ways the FBI is less and less helpful to local police because we've now asked the FBI to do so many other things, whether it's having to do with counterterrorism, domestic intelligence, and things like this. But is there a better role for the FBI in helping increase the possibility that we solve more murders?
I mean, police departments can ask for FBI agents to come in and help them sometimes, and they do.
Mhm.
But you are right that to some degree, and all police departments, including the FBI, have suffered this from the past few years, where we just ask them to do more and more and more.
Mhm.
So on the FBI level, you mentioned counterterrorism. They also just drug trafficking in general and dealing with like all those kinds of issues.
Cyber, they're dealing with
Yeah,
cyber,
cyber
right? In
attacks,
a way
right?
that I think
Exactly.
domestic police forces just, I mean, I don't even want to get to cyber because that's a whole separate conversation. But I'm going to assume that neither the Cincinnati or Louisville police departments know what they're doing on cyber, and I don't mean that in any criticism.
No.
That's just not what they were designed to do.
No. And at the same time, the local and state police departments are dealing with their own like overwork, right? They're asked to like respond to these mental health care cases where what do they do? They're not psychologists. They're not psychiatrists, and so they have to be on the scene in some cases because if people are acting violently or might have guns or
Mhm.
whatever it might be, but like they don't know how to deal with that person. And like it's in the end, look, you see a lot of police officers say this. So like I took this job to become a police officer, not a social worker. And often the work can feel like like you're doing social work. But in
Right.
terms of the FBI, I think, it can play a positive role. I think one of the biggest things it can do is just lead by example. Like it
Mhm.
can show like what exactly the federal government is prioritizing. And I would say not just the FBI, but really all federal law enforcement agencies can play that role. And we haven't, at least in the last under this administration, we haven't really had proof of that they're like
No.
taking this issue seriously
Right.
by any means. And frankly, crime only seems to come up when it's like politically convenient for the
Right.
president more than when he's actually taking it as seriously as an issue. So I think that makes it difficult. Like, ultimately a lot of policing work, a lot of criminal justice work happens at the state and local level. The vast
Right.
majority of it happens there. But one thing the federal government can do is like tell you what you should be prioritizing. And
Hmm.
because, to put it charitably, we're getting mixed messages from the federal government over the last year. Um, it's really difficult for police departments to do that, and they're not getting clear messages on what the priorities are.
Big picture here. Let's talk about the issue of the crime rate is in the news, right? What to believe, what not to believe. I sort of look at, I feel like the further away we get from COVID, the more obvious it is that yes, there was a spike in COVID in all sorts of crimes, right? Violent ones and nonviolent ones. And now that we're back sort of engaging in the society that we had on February 1st, 2020, um, that we're back to sort of typical crime rates. I hate to put them in those terms, but essentially, you know, yes, there might be a spike here or there in a specific incident or a specific gang war, things like this. But for the most part, what we've experienced in the first 2 decades of the 21st century is where we are today. Is that a
Yeah,
fair way of putting it?
I would put a optimistic and pessimistic spin on it. The optimistic spin is it's actually the murder rate this year is on track to be much lower than it has been for at least 65 years. That's when the FBI started tracking national
Mm,
data. So on a national level, the murder rate has really collapsed, and
mm,
that's great news. The pessimistic spin on it is that like the murder rate based on this year's numbers will probably come at 4 per 100,000. I don't expect anybody to know off the top of their head what that means. But if
right.
you compare that to like European or like Japan or Australia, like other wealthy countries, that's not great. And like
Mm.
that's really the fundamental problem in the US is that like even when crime is coming down, it's still at a default baseline much higher than it is, particularly murders, than it is in other places.
Just by curiosity, was this also true 35 and 40 years ago? That
Yes.
our baseline was higher than the baseline of the rest of the Western world?
Oh, especially if you're looking at 35 years ago, pretty much everybody saw like murders rise
Mhm.
and fall after starting around the 70s and 80s. But
It
the
was
the
almost
US,
all, it's pretty clear now that was all drug trafficking related, right? The spike in drug,
well,
the cocaine stuff and crack.
I,
No?
I'd say that's a big part of it. There are also
Yeah.
other theories, like there's honestly like a billion theories about it. One is that, lead in gasoline was making people more aggressive because we have good evidence that like lead is
Mm,
warps people's minds, right? And like
mm.
leaded gasoline took off around the era preceding that, and then we got rid of it as crime started
How
falling. So
about
that's
that?
just
I've heard that view too. I get it, right? The whole, but
it's
yeah.
but the thing I find persuasive about that is that it would explain a global drop since that was a global
Gotcha.
trend.
Gotcha.
But it's also true, we saw drug trafficking obviously take off in the US with crack cocaine and so on and so forth. I also think there was a lot of social discord at the
Mhm.
time. So, you had Watergate, you had the Vietnam War, you had the Cold War in general in the background, you had
Civil rights
like
movement, which
right, the
was
civil
which
rights
was
movement.
right. We were becoming, that was I always remind people we've only been a multiracial democracy for about 55, 60 years,
Right,
right?
exactly.
And what you're describing is the first decade of us as a multiracial democracy. And you could argue that maybe that also created tension.
Yeah, this is something that's just like much harder to measure empirically.
Correct.
But
Right.
when you have periods of like, the social fabric kind of collapsing, and we saw this with COVID, it
Hmm.
seems like crime just spikes. And like, again, the criminal justice system relies on trust. So does our government in general, right? So it makes sense intuitively that if people don't trust the government, they might break the
Yeah.
laws more.
Okay. Trust is down, and yet crime is down.
Yes. So that is another thing. You pointed to phones earlier.
Hmm.
I think it's an understated aspect of this, and I wouldn't just say phones. I'd say screens in general are
Hmm.
keeping kids inside, right? Like that's a big thing. The other thing is in the 90s, especially, we did a lot to improve policing in the US. Like you talked about Bill Clinton's measures to like flood streets with police officers. That was a big thing. But also they learned how to use like all sorts of new technologies
Right.
to actually track crime, see where it's happening on a map, flood police officers in the area. The New York City Police Department in particular is really good at this. And it's the
Right.
safest city in the country, but even when you compare it to like other countries, it's relatively safe.
It's
Um,
interesting with the NYPD, right? Here's a law enforcement agency that 50 years ago didn't have the best reputation, and now it's considered the crown jewel, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they still have problems. Like anytime you
Mhm.
say something like you just said, you're going to get people
I
saying like, "Well,
know.
how about
Yeah.
this, and
Yeah.
this?"
Yeah.
And it's like,
There's plenty of
yes,
this,
it's
this, and
true.
this.
It's
Yes.
true. It's true. Also, it's just a giant city when you with a lot of police officers.
Right.
Some of them are bound to be doing stupid, bad things all the time. But yes, it really is. And I think the other thing I would add is just like, the even though trust in government didn't improve, the end of the Cold War really brought this like whole America is good, this like sense of patriotism that
Hmm.
didn't really exist. And I don't know. I don't have a study telling you that that's probably, but my
Hmm.
that caused the decline in crime. But my hunch is that probably
Hmm.
helped. I mean, it was just a moment
Hmm.
where Americans were more united
Hmm.
in general because they felt that they had just won this
Yeah.
long ongoing conflict.
Before we go, tell me about your journey to become a criminal justice reporter. It's always right. This is literally the they say the best first job you should have is to be the beat cop journalist, right? To walk the streets. And here you've made it a beat for quite some time. Um, how'd you get there?
Well, often when I start at a workplace, I figure out like what is the niche that's missing.
Hmm.
I'm a generalist reporter, so I could really cover anything. I love learning about new things. I love reporting and telling people what I've learned.
That's why I
So
tell people about journalism. It's you get to go to grad school every day
exactly,
because you
it's
don't know, right?
fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, like I'm always thrilled to be. I know a lot of reporters are not like this, but I'm usually thrilled to be assigned a new topic because I get to learn about something new.
Oh,
So
I'm a big fan of I think one of the things we have too much of in journalism is, people atrophy on their beats because
right.
I've been there, done. I call it been there, done that disease. I
Hmm.
worry about it in politics. I think about it all the time. Oh, that kind of candidate can never win until that
Yeah,
candidate wins, right? That's been there, done that disease. And you can get it on any beat that you're on, which then actually can make you miss a story.
right. And it is a little tangential to the point, but often going on other beats helps you in your original beat, right? Like you figure out, like if you're covering politics, I mean, covering literally anything else at any point will give you new insight into politics and how they work, right?
100%.
Like because it's the everything issue. So that's one thing. So anyway, when I started at City Beat, a local alt weekly here
Hmm.
in Cincinnati, I I was just interested in crime because I thought that like at City Beat it was underserved because I mean I was literally the only news reporter at City Beat, so
Hmm.
like I just wanted to cover
They
it.
did gossip at City Hall, right?
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
probably look, I love my alt weeklies around the country, and a lot of time, or you might get one investigative piece, right?
right.
That's all
And
they had the resources for.
right, yeah, yeah, it's just a limited resource problem. So
Mhm.
I always thought like that was an important issue. Then at Vox, I saw the same thing where I was like, they had one other criminal justice reporter when Vox launched, and I was there at the launch, and I was like, okay, I could probably contribute to this, especially when the Ferguson, Missouri protests
Hmm.
happened. It was
Right.
an all hands on deck effort, and I was like, yes, this is what I'm interested in this topic, and I should cover it. And it just kind of went from there. I mean, but it is striking to me. I have found this consistently that in national media they often, obviously in local and state news like outlets, you have to cover
Yeah.
crime. Like it's usually a big deal. But at the national level, I think it gets less attention. I think it's seen as less
100%.
prestigious. And for me, it is, I don't know, it's the issue that one of the issues that affects people on their day-to-day lives the most. So I've always tried to just keep an eye on it and find interesting frames to get people's attention, including by writing headlines like nearly half of murderers get
Yeah.
away with it. So,
Look, I love the fact. By the way, I think the most, and this is why I feel like the Times is thriving in an era where a lot of news organizations are not. I love that you're based in Cincinnati. You're not in New York. You're not in Washington. My sort of my cheap talking point these days about journalism is we have too many reporters in Washington and not enough everywhere else.
right.
And not enough in other topics. And you just sort of have given a pretty good insight of for various reasons, right? The prestigious beat is the White House beat, and I would always say, yeah, the best stories are on Capitol Hill, and that's just in the world of public policy and politics, right? And frankly, if you really want to understand healthcare policy, you're better off going to a rural clinic in pick any state in the middle of the country than you are covering the Department of Health and Human Services, right? So it is sort of one of those, so it is. I'm curious, was it important to the New York Times that you were based not in New York or in the East Coast? Was that an asset, or was that at times a liability?
No, actually, the Katie Kingsbury, who heads the opinion department at the time, she was excited about it. So I think
that's great.
I think they like that. I would say too. I always tell this story because I'm actually lived in DC for a while when I was working at Vox, and I moved to Cincinnati where my family is, and that's why I moved back.
Is this where you grew up? You grew up in Cincinnati?
I moved here from Venezuela when I was 6, and my family is based here, and my husband's family is here as well. So, but what I remember at the time, I told my bosses at Vox, like, look, we need geographical diversity. And to be frank, I was kind of BSing. I didn't really know how much it mattered. But once I moved here, it is really crazy. I mean, just going from DC to here, in DC, people have an easy time imagining not talking to a Trump voter, right? Like they can go through their day-to-day lives literally never conversing with anyone who supports Trump.
How about New York? You actually more likely, I always say DC are more likely to run into somebody, at least that works for Trump. In New York, good luck ever running into a Trump supporter, right?
Here you can't live here and socialize here without knowing how to talk to Trump supporters. And like my in-laws, some of my in-laws are Trump supporters. I'm not gonna, if I don't want to ruin Thanksgiving every time because I might disagree with something Trump did, like I have to learn how to talk about it in like a nice, cordial manner.
A little dispassionate, as I always say. I've always thought that our problem in mainstream media and the national level was our tone sometimes was wrong, even if our facts were correct, right?
Yes, I think there's really there's a way you can tell someone that you think they are wrong without insulting them. And that, I think, is what really you lose that a bit when you live in a place where you are living in a bubble, essentially. So yeah, I think when I moved here, it just, it helped me see issues in a different light. Like anything from crime to immigration to whatever. It's just,
I'm a big fan of, I've always said that the one piece of diversity newsrooms never focus on is geographic.
Yes, and I honestly think it's a big deal. Again, I was BSing at first when I said I wanted to move, but now I totally believe it. It's definitely the case.
All right, let me get you out in here on this. Bengals or Reds? Like, what's the obsession in your household?
Definitely the Bengals. If not, I mean, we don't watch sports much, but I do not like baseball at all. I can watch a football
you're
game.
Venezuelan and you don't like baseball?
No,
you're not going to be allowed back in.
I see the Dodgers photo behind you, and I'm sorry to say this, Chuck, but I'm just not a fan of baseball. But Bengals, and I will also add, Cincinnati soccer team is great. It's actually one of the best in the country, and I love soccer. So,
I was just going to say Cincinnati is, I'm sorry that they lost the Cincinnati Royals, which goes way back when it comes to the NBA. One of the greatest players of all time played for Cincinnati, Oscar Robertson. But it's interesting about soccer. I feel like the state of Ohio in general, between Columbus Crew, between Cincinnati, that there really is it's a really fast growing fan base, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think I'm allowed to say anything nice about Columbus and living in Cincinnati.
So it's a real rivalry.
Yeah. It's a real. Actually, I think there was a game recently. People were yelling at each other in the street. I was eating outside, and it was great. All
right, let me ask the other dumb Cincinnati question. What's that chili you're supposed to like? Is it okay if I say I don't love it?
Yeah, look, I think what everyone gets wrong about Skyline chili, which is amazing, is that it's spaghetti sauce. It's not really chili.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm good with spaghetti sauce. Just call it that, right?
Yeah, you can also put it on like cheese conies, right? Like that. That's fine. But it's just that I think that's a big thing people get wrong. It's a sauce. It's not a true chili in any sense.
Well, look, enjoy Joe Burrow, and not every fan base gets to have a quarterback like that. So even if you guys don't get a Super Bowl with him, it's a joy to watch him play football.
Yeah, hopefully he delivers this year. but we'll see.
Are you fired up about being opinion? What does that mean? How does that change you? Change
I
your
mean,
your beat?
well, before I had zero opinions, Chuck, and now I do. But no, I think I am fired up about it. I'm actually a member of the editorial board, so I'm doing a lot of the editorial board work right now. But yeah.
Hey, wait, by the way, not a lot of people know what that means.
Oh
Just
yeah.
very quickly, you're a member of the editorial board. What does that? I know what it means, but I think people hear that. Do you write the op-eds? Do you write the editorials? What does that mean specifically?
It basically whenever you see the New York Times is the editorial board is telling you something, there's like a group of 5 people. We talk together and we decide on what things we agree with and whatnot, including our publisher. He also chimes in. I shouldn't say chimes in. He has more of a
Mr. Sulzberger gets to say what he wants to say, right?
He gets to say quite a lot.
It's his newspaper, right?
Yes, so and then usually one of us writes it. So you won't see our byline necessarily on there, but it was written by one of the members of the board who
do you guys
it.
vote if you guys are divided on an issue? It's 3-2, say. Do you note that division in the editorial itself, or do you pick another topic?
No, I think that's a interesting question. I think we would generally, this has not happened during my time at the editorial board yet, so I can't tell you this from experience, but I think generally we would try to find some consensus. I mean, I think with basically any topic, you can, you can find some sort of agreement and make the editorial about that while acknowledging that people are divided on other aspects of the issue.
You are a New York Times reporter, and I'm sure many a times you would say, hey, the editorial page is the editorial page. I'm reporting. How mindful are you of that now? You're going to be on the other side, right? And your editorial could make the beat reporter's job a little bit harder.
I mean, it's definitely something that I think the Times has publicly discussed over the past few years. I mean, you've seen a lot of journalists come out and be like, should we be endorsing presidential candidates, for example? And obviously with the Washington Post, that led to a lot of, backlash. But I think it's a general conversation because at the end of the day, if you endorse Kamala Harris, all the people covering her campaign, they are going to look unfairly or not, like they're biased, right? And because people just do not know. I mean, we try really hard to put opinion at the top and all that, but most people just are not aware of those divisions, and it makes it much more difficult. So it is something that we are definitely very, very mindful of.
I lived it. We used to say the cable channel, let's our op-ed page. Yeah, it didn't always, if the logo's in the same place, right? The same person signs our checks, right? The same person. I understand why somebody who's not in our industry goes, I don't get the difference.
Well, especially a lot of people get their news through social media, TikTok, whatever.
Right.
They legitimately do not see, if you go to the New York Times homepage right now, it is very clearly divided between opinion and news, but you're not seeing that on social media when you click a link. You just, and it's so easy to just scroll past, it's saying opinion and whatever. And look, at the end of the day, I think it is important for newspapers to have both opinion and news sides. So and we do our best to present those differences, but yeah, it is something that I think every news outlet is grappling with.
Herman, this was great. I appreciate you coming on. I just thought, sometimes you see a piece and you're like, why isn't this is the type of headline that some politician should be exploiting for the right reasons, right?
Right.
And
I feel that about every single thing I write, Chuck.
Of course. No. I feel that about every monologue I do at the beginning. This should really fire people up. Yeah, good luck with that. But look, that's the job of a journalist. It's one story at a time. And if you get one person to think about something differently, you've done your job. So, I thought it was a great piece. And well framed and and sort of well explained, right? Which is what made it so compelling. And you were a terrific guest here. So I appreciate it.
Well, I love to hear that. And also, you just kind of suggested, one of the ways you actually make an impact is by doing follow-ups. You don't just report a story once and leave. So, just being on here, it's great that you're getting the story out. So I appreciate it.
All right, Herman. Appreciate it. Talk soon.
Bye.